This is the story of a seething folk tale called the King's Soup. Once there was a wonderful kingdom, and the land was perfect. In fact, everything should have been perfect, and it would have been if it were not for a selfish king. The king wanted everything that was good in the land, and so he just took it. And every room in his palace was filled with belongings and objects. But although the palace was full, his heart was empty. One day, the king decided he wanted to go for a ride, so he got his servants together and he said, "Bring me the finest riding clothes in all the land and the finest whip and the finest horse there is." Well, the servants knew where to go and get the clothes and the whip. That was easy. They just went to the richest houses in the land and demanded the clothes. But where to get the horse, that was another matter. But one of them said, "I've heard the story of the great white horse of Seething. Why don't we go and get that?" So they rode to Seething, and there was the most beautiful white horse you could ever imagine. And they took it. And the little old lady to whom the horse belonged was very sad. When they got back to the palace, the king said, "Right, put me in my riding clothes." And he put on the clothes. And he said, "Don't I look the most wonderful horseman in all the world?" Well, the servants had to try not to laugh because he looked ridiculous. But they couldn't say that. So they said, "Yes, sire, you look absolutely marvellous." "Right," he said, "put me on the white horse." And they sat him on top of the horse. And he put on his crown and he took the whip and he said, "Now don't I look the most magnificent horseman in the whole world?" Well, he didn't. He looked like a frog on a white mountain. But they didn't dare say anything. So they said, "Yes, sire, you look absolutely wonderful." "Right," he said, "I'm going for a ride." And he picked up the whip and he whipped the horse. And the great white horse of Seething reared up and shot out of the palace faster than anybody had ever seen a horse run. So fast that the 4 servants just couldn't keep up. Well, the king was no horseman. After the horse had jumped over the first hedge, the crown had fallen off. By the second hedge, he'd lost the whip. As he went through the trees, his clothes were shredded. And when the horse got back to Seething and stopped still, the king shot right over the top and landed in a blackberry bush. By the time he stepped out, his clothes were shredded, he was covered in mud and purple, and he was screaming. Nearby, there was a little wooden hut with a little door. And opening it, out stepped a little old lady. And she looked and she said, "My goodness me, it's a talking bush. Come here, come here." And the king, looking decrepit, walked up. She said, "Come inside, come inside." And the king stepped into the smallest house he had ever seen. There was one fire, one table, one chair, and almost nothing else. But he sat down on the chair because he felt so bad. And just as he was about to speak, the little old lady said, "Now then, dear, you look like you need some soup." And she put a bowl in a big pan and lifted soup into a wooden bowl and gave it to the king. Well, the king took a little wooden spoon, lifted the soup up and tasted it. And in that moment his life changed. Because all of a sudden he felt like he was back being a baby held in his mother's arms. He felt like he was playing with his friends in the palace garden. Suddenly the sky seemed bluer and the sun seemed brighter, and he said, "This is the most wonderful, wonderful soup." She said, "Oh, thank you, dear, I'm glad you like it." He said, "No, it's absolutely marvellous. How is it made?" And she said, "Well, it's very simple. The ingredients were planted with love, they were watered with love, they were grown with love, I cooked it with love, and now I'm sharing it with you as Leffie Ganderson would have wanted with love." And the king said, "This is just beautiful soup." And she laughed and she said, "Yes, it's soup fit for a king." And at that point he finished. He said, "I want some more." She said, "Well, I'm afraid there is no more. You've eaten all I could make. It was for me." He said, "But I want more." She said, "But there is no more." And he said, "I want this soup fit for a king." And she said, "I'm sure." And he said, "I am the king." Well, the little old lady just burst out laughing. She'd never seen a more ridiculous sight. A tatty little old man in purple and mud saying he was the king. Well, she couldn't stop laughing. Now, the king had never been laughed at before. And surprisingly, he wasn't very pleased. He got up and he kicked the table over. And he knocked over the stand by the fire and he smashed down her table. And he said, "I will not be insulted by you." And he walked out. And as he walked out, breathless, 4 horsemen came up. He pushed the first one off the horse and pulled himself up. "Right," he said, "I want you to burn down that wooden hut." And off he rode. A week later, sitting in the palace, the king was unhappier than he had ever been. Everybody knew, because he was so angry with everyone. He tried to remember when he'd last felt happy, and all he could remember was the soup. Then he had an idea. Right, he said, bring me the finest chefs in all the land. Within an hour, 101 chefs stood in front of him. Now then, I want you to make soup. Oh, they all thought, we can make soup. He said, this is no ordinary soup. This is soup that is fit for a king. This is soup that when you taste it, you feel like you're being held in your mother's arms. You feel like you're playing with your childhood friends. The sky must be bluer, the sun must be brighter. You can have any ingredient in the land. You can have the finest cooking utensils, the finest stoves. I want that soup. The next day, he walked into the great room of the palace. Down the middle was the biggest table you could ever imagine, 101 golden bowls and 101 silver spoons. Standing behind each one was the chef. The king started to toast. 50 soups later, he was getting angry. By the 100th soup, he was furious. The 101st bowl. "No, this is rubbish," he cried, and he stormed up. The chefs began to shake, and he thought, there is only one person in this whole land who can make that soup, and it is the little old lady of Seething. He was about to shout to his servants, bring me the old lady, when he suddenly remembered, now wait, she said, it must be grown with love, watered with love, gardened and cared with love, cooked with love and shared with love. If I drag her here, there's no way that... So he said, servants, could you ask the little old lady of Seething to come here? Well, the servants were in absolute shock. Said, excuse me, sir, did you say ask? Yes. Well, all right. And off they went. 3 hours later, the little old lady was standing in front of him. Now, I wonder, he said, whether you might be prepared to make that soup you made for me once before. Well, that's great. Yes, I'll happily make you that soup, said the little old lady. Oh, great, he said. Now, all the finest ingredients in the land are over there. So the little old lady walked over and she walked up and down and she came back. She said, sire, I'm sorry to disappoint you, but the ingredients I need are not there. What, he said, beginning to feel angry. No, don't worry, she said, because I have brought them with me. Where? She opened up a tiny little bag and she took out one little old potato and one dirty little leek. This is all I need, she said. That, he said, looking in disgust. Oh yes, she said, I'll need butter and cream, but that's all here. No, wait, there's one more thing I need. The king looked on in horror. You can have anything, anything you want in the kingdom. Great, she said. I want you. Come down here. The king came down from his throne and stood next to the little old lady. Right, she said. Roll up your sleeves. The king rolled up his silk sleeves. Right. Take this knife and peel that potato. All of the court held their breath as the king leant forward and began to peel the potato. As he did it, he began to feel something strange. You see, the king had never done any work in his life. He'd always got somebody else to do it. Before long, he was slicing up the leek. Moments later, he put butter in the pan and onions and put it all together with the water. By the end of it, he was smiling as he stirred the soup. Right, said the little old lady, I'm just going to mash it while you go and get prepared. As he sat down on the throne, the little old lady mashed up the soup and tipped it into a little wooden bowl and gave him a little wooden spoon. The king sat back. The whole court looked on. Yes, he said, imagining himself back in his mother's arms. Yes, he said, seeing himself playing with his friends. Yes, he said, as the sky was bluer and the sun was golden, this is the soup that is fit for a king. The little old lady mimicked his voice. Yes, of course it is, because it's grown with the finest leek and the finest potato. And she burst out laughing. The whole court stood. She laughed at the king. But then something happened that those people who were there said, well, they'd never see it again. And I doubt anybody ever will. Nor will you ever hear it. It's the sound of somebody laughing for the first time in 40 years. It started in his feet. They started to tremble. then his legs, then his body, then his arms, then suddenly out of his mouth came a laugh like you would have never heard. So glorious was this laugh that everybody in the palace laughed along with it. Before long they were wiping their eyes, and the king suddenly stood and stopped. He said, right, from today 2 things will happen. 1, we are going to carve an enormous white horse in the Hill of Seething to always remember the great white horse that brought me to this soup. And secondly, every year we will come together as a community. We will build an enormous table. We will bring our leeks and our potatoes, and together, great and good and poor and small, we'll peel, we'll share, we'll cook, and then we'll eat together. And when it's all over, we will take everything away, so you won't even know that happened, except 2 things. You'll be warm in your stomach because of the soup, and you'll be warm in your heart because of the new friends you've made. And so, on Sunday, October the 17th, 2010, we're going to do the King's Soup, and we want you to come along. It's a festival for everybody. Come along on your own, come along in a group. If you can, bring a potato or bring a leek, but if you can't bring anything, that doesn't matter. But at Jewson's Yard at 1:15 we will start to make the soup together, and I hope by 4:15 we'll take down the table and we'll all go away. But on Monday morning, if you see somebody on your way to work or somebody at school or just somebody in the street, just smile, because you both shared the King's Soup.